Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third talk about working in the games industry. We're going to be talking to Ashley today, working as a narrative designer. Ashley, can you introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about what you do and as much as you can about who you do it for?
Hello, I am Ashley Ruhl. I am the narrative director on Star Wars: The Old Republic at BioWare Austin.
Awesome. Can you tell me what exactly you do in that position and how that relates to narrative design?
Yeah, so as a narrative director and a narrative designer, I am the glue of the game in terms of narrative. So mainly my role is to help guide the narrative voice of the game. Our game is very narrative focused, so it's making sure that everyone is aligned to that vision, and that goes between writing, cinematics, level design, environment art, gameplay, making sure that we're all telling a consistent, cohesive story between all of those departments. So the narrative is not just expressed through writing and cinematics and cutscenes, that kind of thing, but it's also expressed in how you set dress the world, what kind of interactions you give the player to make, how you design the level, like how you interface with the world changes how the narrative is expressed. So my job is just to make sure all of those things are consistent and that they're all telling the same tone, the same emotional beats, the same story throughout the game.
You said something there, and I'm going to deviate from script slightly for this one because I think it's interesting. You said, aligning the narrative with gameplay. How do you think that the mechanics of gameplay affect the kind of narrative that works or is appropriate in different games? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's my personal philosophy is that the way we express narrative in games is still kind of in its infancy. We haven't really found a consistent, cohesive way that really speaks to our medium. We do lean on the language of film a lot for expressing narrative, so that's why cutscenes, especially in AAA, are such a big deal, and they have more money put into them to make it feel more realistic. But it's because we already understand the language of film as a vehicle for storytelling. So I think that we're still trying to figure out how to make sure how to use the interactivity of games to tell a story, because it's not just about telling a story, it's about living a story, it's about experiencing and making choices. The way we can express narrative is not necessarily just a clean script where A followed by B followed by C. In a game, we are giving the player space and agency to tell their own story within the story that we're building. So it's kind of, I describe it as like a yes and. It's like an improv where I'm creating a prompt, I'm creating a space for the player to build off of their own headcanon or their own experience of it. But in designing the narrative, I need to leave that space. I need to leave space for the player to experience the story in the way that they want to, in the way they want to express how their character moves through the scenes, how they choose to interface with the world. I think like an example of that would be Assassin's Creed, for example. If you're running through the world of Assassin's Creed, you're telling a story by how you interact with the world. If you're super stealthy and you're never seen and you get through the entire world without hurting anybody but your intended target, it tells a different story than if you are a brawler and you just murder everything from point A to point B. So you're building your own narrative through the way that you play through the worlds and experience it, and that's outside of any written lines of dialogue. But that doesn't mean that the dialogue itself can't support those different kinds of paths. Maybe characters react to you differently based on your behavior. Maybe you have dialogue choices that shape how characters react to you or how you build relationships with other characters. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, different games have different degrees of sort of specificity of the narrative in the game, whether it's left open to tell for the story to be about being a stealthy assassin or being a brawler. You know, some games are going to only tell one of those stories. Some games are going to leave the narrative open to be interpreted either way, or vary either way. But in either case, if you're writing the narrative of the story to be about a stealthy assassin and you don't allow those verbs in gameplay, then your narrative's not going to align. So at a bare minimum, you need to have whatever your narrative is be reflected in the experience of playing the game. And if you're wanting to let players build their own story emergently, then you're really having to create gameplay that supports multiple modes of interaction, as well as creating narrative that can be presented to reflect those different paths. And that's really hard. So
yeah, it's tone consistency of, between story and interactivity, and what, like you said, what stories you want to be able to tell in those spaces or allow to be told.
Yeah, I think what you were describing probably sounds really familiar to anybody who's run tabletop role-playing games and is trying to not tell their own story, but allow the story to reflect the actions of the players and build on what they're doing by creating a world for the players to explore and interact with, as opposed to sort of an on-rails narrative. And that's challenging to do when you have a sentient GM managing all of those pieces. But when you're trying to build a game that's going to do that in an automated way, we haven't solved that yet.
yeah, and I think part of it is definitely dropping hints as you go, and that you're building a world that the player feels inclined to behave a certain way based on the clues and tone that you've already built in front of it. I talk about dialogue choices, like reaching a dialogue choice where like someone is mean to you and you want to get revenge, only works if you built up that relationship with that character, that you don't like them or that you want to take revenge. So it's everything that you build before it to sort of hopefully set up the player to want to be thinking in that direction. I Ratchet. To make the choices that you want for the tone. Some players just want to completely go, divert from the tone completely, but that's a choice. So you want to set up the tone to match the gameplay that you want them to experience.
Yeah, there's a game design pattern from the book that I wrote that says in order to create meaning in procedural narrative, but I think in narrative in general, that you need three pillars. The first one being context for whatever is going to happen. The second one being motivation for the player to engage or do the thing. And then the third one being consequences for that player's action. And that if you don't have any of those three pillars, you're going to have difficulty allowing the player to create meaning in the thing that happened.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. So let me get us back on track here, because I could do this all day. What do you do on a typical day as in the role of designing narrative?
So my role is as the narrative director is interesting because I'm still kind of new at it. To be fair, I'm working with our writers to make sure that like the writing that we're building is going to work for the content that we can create, that we have scope that is going to fit within the schedule that we have. But then from there I'm making sure that all the pieces are aligned towards that narrative. So then I work with art to make specific art requests to say, oh, we're going to need this asset to tell this part of the story, and then getting reviews where I review those assets and make sure that they work within what we're trying to do for the story. I work with the level designers to say, hey, this cutscene happens here, and we're coming, gameplay is starting here, and then it continues in this direction. Is this space going to serve the scene that we're going to build? Does it make sense? Is the player's eye line looking where we want it to be looking? Does it make sense that they would be in this space, or that, what choices would I want to make as a player that I don't want the player to want? So I'm like, how can I shape the space to change their intentions? So it's a lot of basically being the advocate for the narrative and talking with all these really talented departments to make sure we're all saying the same thing. So it's very much a glue role. coming from cinematics, I've also done, some cinematic design where I'd go and set up a stage and start building a scene. And at a micro level, I would be working with environment and VFX and art to build just that scene. But now this is more macro where I'm looking at the whole thing, the whole flow of it all, and making sure that we have all those details covered and that everyone's, speaking the same story. But then at an even higher level, I'm also looking out further, months, years in advance to see, okay, we're building this story here. How does it relate to the next thing and the next thing, and make sure we're leaving content, or we're telling content now that's going to affect content later, because in the game that I'm working on, it's several updates a year of story, and it just keeps going and going and going, rather
Right.
than one like game that launches. So we have to make sure that we're creating connective tissue for everything that we want to tell.
Yeah, having a balance between leaving hints and foreshadowing stuff that's coming in the future, so it doesn't seem like it's out of left field, but at the same time not painting yourself into a corner and having a bunch of backstory that never ends up becoming relevant because the game went in a different direction for
Mhm.
other reasons.
Yeah, and I will say it's very fun to sort of drop subtle hints down into the story, and then see if players pick up on them, and then see like theories come out, like, oh, I think this is going to happen. I'm like, yes. So that's super fun.
I can only imagine with a huge and dedicated player base like your game has, the degree to theory crafting and lore mining that must happen. Even in Pop Tropica, when I was working on it, I would read the blogs the kids were posting about, what the motivations and backstory of our small two-dimensional characters were, and the theories that they would craft. And it's like, wow, I never thought of that, but yes, that is totally what we were thinking.
That's the magic to me, is that if we, like I said, if you leave enough space for the player to build their own headcanon or build their own theories, and really get immersed in the world based on the creativity that they place into the thing that you made, but it gave them space to create their own characters, their own fan art, their own stories. That is magic to me.
Yeah, totally. All right. So what is life like in a giant studio? How, to the degree that you can say, how many people are you working with like immediately, and then sort of within your location in the studio, and what's it like being part of such a massive undertaking?
It's interesting. I've been on slightly smaller teams, and I say slightly because I think the smallest team I've ever been on is about 60 people. So as the team gets larger, you have much more specific roles and jobs to do. I think that when the team is smaller, have fewer you have fewer places that information can get lost, because everyone's wearing a million hats, but at the same time you have to keep context switching between roles and between jobs. When the team gets bigger, you can be much more specific about your specialization, but it's really important to have communication as clear as possible, because that's where stuff gets lost in private messages or emails. And so one of the things that we're really adamant about is making sure that everything is seen, and as much as possible is seen in sort of group chats or channels that anybody can access.
Yeah.
Especially now in the world of hybrid and remote, everything needs to be documented so that anyone who's not physically in the room can see what everyone's talking about, can catch up asynchronously, give feedback, make sure that everybody's on the same page there. So yeah, I say as the team gets bigger, the deliberate communication is really important.
Yeah, documentation is so important, and making sure that you want people to become subject matter experts, but you don't want anyone to become the repository of this knowledge and then they leave and where are you?
Yes.
Our group is 60 to 110 students in the studio this semester,
Mhm.
and working on a single game. And each semester, at least 50% of those students cycle out. So every 6 months, we have a 50% turnover rate. And how do you
Wow.
maintain institutional knowledge? How do you, build momentum when you're having that kind of intended turnover?
Mhm.
And so it's figuring out how to adapt what works in the industry to what works in that kind of environment is one of the challenges that we're grappling with. So.
Yeah, yeah, it takes a lot, both at a group level and an individual level, because you have to say these are the standards that we are adopting as a group, but then it's about developing those habits for each person, that if you want this to work, everybody needs to do it. Yeah. Everyone needs to be communicating, over communicating, and making it as visible as possible for everybody.
Yeah, awesome. So what's the best thing about being a narrative director?
I think the best, like I touched on it a little bit, but I think the best thing for me is seeing players react and create based on the things that I've created. Uh, I think that interactive narrative is a really special thing, because it it affects you more personally than, you know, movies or television, in my opinion. I think that you can definitely see someone on screen and connect with them and say that's similar to my world experience, and, or, you know, this character really touched me. But I think in games, whenever, like, down to the simplest thing is like giving a character a name, you know, giving Link a name, or just any amount of customization, dialogue choices, anytime you have the ability to uh, augment your character in the game in a way that is personal to you, even if it doesn't reflect you as a person, like who you see yourself as, you're still embedding a part of yourself into this character that you've created. And I always think that, like, especially in our game with dialogue choices, that whatever dialogue choices you make, you are reflecting that back on yourself. Like, would I make that choice in real life, or is this completely opposite to what I would do in real life, and why is that? I think that games have a lot of space for self-reflection and self-discovery. And I think that, especially when I start to see like people making fan art of their characters, or telling fan fiction of like the things that their characters get up to when they're not on screen, when they're not in the game, the fact that I have inspired somebody to create more art based on art I've created is incredibly amazing to me. I think that's definitely my favorite part.
Nice. I'm going to deviate from script again to ask a follow-up here. When you're writing dialogue or narrative around a character, sometimes that is a NPC that you have complete control over, all the context that the player has seen them in, what they've said before, you know, and you can write a cutscene with them that's going to play out in a certain way, and create that narrative. And sometimes you know, in an MMO, the character that you're writing dialogue for is a PC, and like who they are and what's going on in their background and what kind of experience they've had before, you can't write. What's it like to write those two kind of characters, and what does the variability of player characters allow you to do that, you know, that you can't do when it's canned, right? Because you could say, well, it's always easier to write NPCs because you have complete control. It's always easier to write static cutscenes because you have complete control. What do you get when you give the players that control in terms of the narrative that you're producing as the game designer?
Yeah, it's not easy. I think in our case, it's about creating, thinking about archetypes for the player, because you can't write a completely blank slate or let the player like enter in their own response. So thinking about the archetypes that we have within our game that we want to play to, and then making sure that all of our choices give the player some freedom to choose between different responses, but also don't betray any of those archetypes. For example, like you have like, say you have the 3 dialogue choices, and often 3 dialogue choices are like Paragon, Renegade, and like snarky or questioning is usually in the center. And so you get that sort of moral alignment there, to choose from. But if you have a scene where your character could be, you know, plucky rogue, or, you know, a terrifying emperor, you have to make sure that the choices that you're creating do not betray the play styles of either character. So it kind of waters down a little bit how you phrase things, how you phrase the dialogue choices. But in that way, the player can project more of their own interpretation of what their character, who their character is because of that. If you simplify it down and you make it a little bit less precise and in the voice, the player has more space to fill in the blanks.
Yeah. It's hard to
it's
not make it too generic so it doesn't feel like their choices are being honored. And then the temptation to say, well, we'll just have different dialogue, for every different player class, so and race, so that it's in alignment with the archetypes that we've created in our universe. It's like, yeah, but then who's going to voice all of that? And yeah.
yeah. It's definitely a tough line to walk. It's just like, it's different for every moment, every dialogue choice. And I think it's fun personally to try and create as much space, as much flavor to make you feel engaged in the narrative, but as much space for the player to interpret it as possible. Like I love just cutting to reaction shots of characters and not having like super blank slate face, but like maybe there's just like a glance, and then the player can interpret that in like 1,000 different ways. Like, oh, they're suspicious, or oh, they're afraid, and but it gives the player a bit more space to, it gives them somewhere to jump off from, to like start thinking about what did that mean, but I'm not telling them exactly what it meant, because I want to leave space for them to tell me what it meant.
Cool. All right, back on track. What's the worst thing about being a narrative director?
The worst thing, I think it would be that we can't make everything. That there's so many cool things we can do, and scoping and trying to make sure that we are working within the capabilities of our time and our team and our schedule, can be tough, because there's often so many great ideas that come from the team, from brainstorming. We go, oh, it'd be so cool if we had this huge epic space battle. It's like, well, do we have the budget and the assets to create said space battle? Can we do it justice in a way that makes it cool as the way we imagine it in our heads? So I think the hardest thing is saying no and scoping. And it doesn't mean that the thing that's the final product is going to be bad. It just means that we are playing within the scope of what our team can actually create in a healthy way, on a healthy schedule, and not working overtime. And it's a little sad to let those things go, but at the same time, we're always creating more art the next day. Like, we're always creating more game the next day, and I would rather live like making things that we are capable of making and saying, yeah, I'm proud of that, than trying to overwork myself because it's like a passion to make this the greatest thing that has ever happened, because that project will end, and I will still exist the day after. So I have to keep enjoying my work. But yeah, it is hard to say goodbye, or maybe even put a pin in things that the grand dreams that I would love to do, in the future, or the things I have to scope down.
Yeah, I feel like the more experienced a game designer is, the more comfortable and like appealing they find constraints around their design.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, having constraints lets you do that thing that you're being constrained into at 100%, as opposed to, yeah. I hate being asked like, blue sky, what would you do? And I'm like, I don't know. Give me some constraints. Come on.
Give me rules.
Right. And in terms of scope and narrative, that's definitely something that students last year really struggled with our game, was coming up with, all this narrative and backstory and like sets of events. And it's like, you've written a novel here, and that's lovely, but like, where is this going to happen in the game? Where is this piece of information going to be conveyed? And you've like, to write this story, it would take, a studio, 5 years to produce that game. even as a 2D pixel art game, because you've written so much story, we have 6 levels. Where does this fit in that, in that scope? And getting new narrative designers to understand everything that you want to convey has to be conveyed within the context of this game. Your scope needs to be much smaller. That seems to be a big hurdle. So,
not to mention that writing is usually where you start, but there is so many departments that come after that. Like, we have our writing team, and if they wait until the last minute to finish writing, that affects the schedule of every other department after them, like cinematics, and then VFX and sound and art and everything that needs to come after. So it's working within the time constraints that you have, but also being considerate for all the departments that come after you. But to your point of like, how much are you going to see? Coming from cinematics again, I always like to reduce the amount of words, because I feel like I can tell more visually, non-verbally, or at least give more tone. So I when I look at a narrative, I go, okay, what are you saying with all these words, and what is the tone? What is the emotion that you're trying to get across here? And can you really boil that down to like a third, a fourth, a tenth of what you wrote? Because really what you're trying to create with a game is an experience. You're creating an experience, and do all the words that you've written lend themselves to that experience? And if they're like, well, this is extra flavor, it's like, well, does it need to be part of it? Can it be something that players can go investigate elsewhere, like on the side, or is it DLC, or but really boiling it down to the why, the tone and the emotion helps.
Even, is that actually just some environmental narrative that exists in the background of the cinematic that the player may or may not even notice, but like can, or is it critical to their like explicit understanding of what's going on in the game?
Yeah, like I think about Journey. Journey has no dialogue in it, but it has a very moving emotional story.
Oh yeah.
And so yeah, just thinking about, okay, what is that tone I'm trying to hit? How much can I reduce words to tell that story?
Yeah, and you can tell the pretty nuanced, sophisticated story there with no words.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. So what would you say to yourself as a freshman going into college to study game design? And one, did you do that? And what was your path, I guess, in brief? But then sort of beyond that, if you had gone to school for game design, what's the first thing you would have told yourself going into really studying that?
So I went to school for animation, and I was in the computer school at DePaul University. And I started doing game stuff around junior, senior year. I started looking at their game program and doing some of their game curriculum. So I didn't start in games, but one of the things I have told students in the past is always, like, especially in game design, reaching outside of games for your inspiration and for your for the things that influence your game. For example, like studying philosophy or world ethics or economics, and just taking any kind of classes that really appeal to you just as a person. All of those things will affect how you build a game. I think that often we can cannibalize ourselves and our art by saying, I want to make games, so all I'm going to do is play games and study games and make games. But so many of the greatest games are based on things that are outside of games, that are brought into games. They're like, this is an experience I had, and now I'm making it a digital interactive experience. So I always tell people, don't think that, well, one, don't think you can't make games because you aren't that much of a gamer, because you can make great games coming from any background.
Sure.
And two, don't just look at games for your inspiration to making games. Really look at, go into other art, like look at comics or, movies, live theater, improv. Really just grab at everything, and all of those things will, in one way or another, explicitly or implicitly, affect how you make games.
And I would say that all of those things are important, right? And your school, your undergraduate time, you have more freedom to reach broadly and study, study a bunch of things that maybe you wouldn't have time to pursue in a master's program that was more focused. That said, there's not enough time in school to study all the stuff that you need to study to make good games. So if you're committing yourself to being a good game designer, you're going to be needing to continue that study throughout your life. You're going to need to be picking up that book or that audio book or watching that YouTube series or taking that Udemy class on topics broadly for the rest of your life in order to have the breadth that you need to make the best games.
Yeah. If nothing else, studying human behavior like psychology, sociology, and understanding why we make the choices we make, how society shapes us, how culture shapes us, really can help you understand a little bit more about game design philosophy and player behavior.
Yeah. So what would you say to yourself a little bit later on your first day as a professional game developer doing narrative design?
I would say that there are no experts. and ask a lot of questions and always ask questions. Mostly what I mean by there are no experts is that we're all learning and we're all growing. And even if we have learned a lot about a specific thing, we will never know everything about it. Nobody does. So you can't really aim to be, I'm going to be the expert. I'm going to be the one that knows everything about this topic. And even then, like if there's someone who's been at a studio for 10 years, they only know how that studio works. They don't know how other studios work because every game studio is different. I joke that in film, when you're like going from set to set, if you're working on one movie, you're working on the next, they don't have to reinvent the camera every time they go to a new set. But we kind of do that in games. Like we're on different engines, we have different technology, different scripts, different programming behind under the hood. So yeah, I just making sure that you never feel like you're falling behind because you don't know everything. And knowing that you'll always ask questions. I still ask questions. I've been in the industry for 11 years and I still go, I don't know how this works. Can you tell me? And that also I try to do that also because I think it comes across a lot better for people if it comes from a place of power or a place of leadership. If someone in leadership can say, I don't know this, can you explain it to me? Allows everybody else in the room to feel like, oh, cool. Whew, I thought I had to know that. I don't have to know that. So
the best leaders that I've worked under have been people who, were humble and admitted when they didn't know things and fostered an environment where questioning and asking questions was a positive. That's not always the case, right? There are leaders who are insecure, who pretend like they know more than they do, and take any admission of lack of knowledge as a sign of weakness. Those are toxic places to work. Get out of them.
yes, for sure.
But they exist, and be aware of that. The line between being humble and knowing that you don't know everything and knowing that your boss doesn't know everything and questioning and asking why they're making a decision they're making in a way that's respectful is challenging. I know that I assumed when I came into the industry that like my bosses were gods. Like, of course they knew what they were doing. Like they did stuff that seemed completely against every understanding of design that I had. And I was like, but like they're my boss and like they're real game designers. And so like they clearly know what they're doing and I'm just going to follow their lead. And years later, I'm like, wow, they were just making it up as they went along and making some bad calls there. Moving past my bosses are dumb and I'm going to question everything that they're saying, which doesn't go over well. Don't do that. And getting to the place of being able to, have a good relationship with the people making decisions, be able to question them and make sure that that they do have rationale behind what they're doing and that it does align with what you understand of game design is an ongoing challenge, right?
Yeah, I think I've this is just my personality, but I always ask the why. And I'm not like accusing anyone or saying, oh, if you don't have the answer, I'm judging you. but I always ask the why, and you can tell the leaders that are like, oh, that's interesting, I didn't think about that. Let me rethink why we're doing that. And the people that go, oh, because I said so, or why are you questioning me on this? And you can kind of start to suss out what kind of person they are just by asking those questions. But I always pivot it towards, I'm asking why, so I know how to do the best job within my purview, within my specialty. So I'm like, when I would ask as a cinematic designer, I'd say, okay, why does the character say it this way? Why are they saying this line? Where is that coming from emotionally? Because I'm going to assume the writer knows why they're saying that. So I would ask, like, okay, and then if I know the answer to that, then I can project that visually through the cinematics. So it's always from a place of how I'm asking questions to make sure I can do my job, my specific job, to the best of my ability, not into interrogating someone or saying, do you actually know what you're doing, but more just like, how can I make sure that my piece of this fits the best with what everybody else is creating?
Nice. We're running a little long, but one more question before I ask you to close up. So you've talked a lot, or a little bit earlier, about narrative design sort of in some ways coming early, and then the game being produced based, in order to enact that narrative, or to apply that narrative to level design and to cinematic design and so on going forward. So how does your role relate practically to the other departments that are involved in actually instantiating the narrative that you have conceived of?
So within my director role, it's a lot of just approvals. It's kind of giving direction and giving the why of, like, why are we building this level? Why does the road need to turn left here? Why does the character need to have a sword here? So that's kind of what my role, like I said, is kind of a glue between the different departments. I think as a narrative designer, in a lot of studios, narrative designers can be a writer, it can be a scripter, but it is working between, like, making sure that moments in scripts trigger off at the right moments to tell the story in the way that you want to tell it. So it again, it's just, narrative is kind of a weird it's amorphous in a way, and it's different at every studio, but it is kind of the through line that exists through all of it, that exists through every department. And narrative is in everything. It's in every role, every discipline, because we are telling a story with the pieces that we're putting into it, how we time combat, how we set the lighting in the particular room. So a narrative designer is just talking through those beats with every department, or at least playing through it and going, like, is this consistent? Is what we're trying to do consistent here? And starting from a place of writing the dialogue, if there is dialogue, or just saying, like, these are the series of beats that we want the player to experience, and then working with gameplay to build, okay, what's the gameplay in those experiences, working with level design to say, what is the physical road we're taking for this experience? It's just kind of being the voice of the experience in that way.
I think it's important to note that Ashley's been talking about how narrative in games, but it's not always the writing or the dialogue that is being talked about, that narrative is in everything. In an earlier different lifetime, I worked doing fight choreography for stage combat. And it would be like, all right, so this character and this character are going to have a fight, and the script is just like, they fight. But every action that either character took, the way that fight went, whether one character is overpowering the other character, or what weapons they're using, or what kind of moves they're using, how skilled a fighter they are, all of those things needed to be aligned with who these characters are, and what story is this fight telling. Is this a fight about how this person was narrowly defeated, or about how this person was crushed, or about how this person limped away nursing a grudge? Each of those is going to require a different set of moves in the fight. and the script may just say they fight, but you need to think beyond that and create narrative, in this case, just using action. So I think that's the kind of thing you're talking about.
Mhm.
You know, and it could be, what's the lighting of the scene, what is the mood and environment we're trying to create, that's narrative. What are the sound cues that are happening in this space, that needs to be aligned with the narrative. It can't just be ambient sounds. It's like, well, yes, but what are the ambient sounds that contribute to this moment in the narrative?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I think that, there are certain directors, narrative directors, that will be very specific as to exactly what, like, I want an audio cue here, I want, the lighting to be here. But I think there's a way to infuse the narrative through suggestion with other departments. That I'll go to the environment artist and say, this room needs to feel sad, like grief. And what can you, as an environment artist, give me to express that?
Yeah.
So and you are giving the reins of the narrative to people on your team to tell the narrative through their discipline.
Right.
But you're still like a guiding hand to make sure it's all consistent. That's my ideal, is giving the narrative to every department, but giving them the why.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, because I mean, you're not an audio designer, so like, what's the most effective way to create the emotion of grief in a particular room with audio? Like, that I mean, maybe but that's not your job to know. That's the person who's doing that piece of the design's job.
Mhm.
And as narrative designer or director, describing that and conveying that to the other departments so they can execute with their expertise and reach a shared vision. That's the communication you were talking about.
Yeah, and to that point, it's like, so much of my job feels like I'm doing nothing at all and I'm doing everything at once, because it is so much like about communication. Like you said, it is about communicating clearly to every department of what your expectations are through their medium and through their discipline. But also at the same time, you're like, well, I'm not physically putting it in, but I am conveying it in multiple different ways in order to reach one feel. So
Mhm.
it's dancing between those two thought processes a lot.
Yeah, awesome. Do you have any closing thoughts for the students as we sign off?
Um, yeah, I think narrative is in everything, and everyone can tell a story, but I'm always, my goal is to tell stories through emotion. So I think that the more you can focus on what is the emotional experience I want the player to have, the more fluid and better constructed your story will be.
Awesome. That's fantastic. You've worn a lot of hats over the years, and hopefully I'll be able to circle back with you later in the semester and talk to you about some of those different areas of expertise, particularly your cinematic design background. I'd love to dig into that more, and hopefully we'll have that chance.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
All right. Thank you all so much.